Alright everybody, so this is the third lecture having to do with predation, and I thought it would be worthwhile to ask this question. Are prey controlled by predators? Okay, and this has to do with the ecological and arguments that are for this answer, right? So, I mean, it kind of follows that if predators have no effect, have no ecological effect, we know that they have an evolutionary effect, right? There are all these adaptations, physical adaptations and stuff that show that predation has an evolutionary effect. But is there an ecological effect? Now we probably can't really think of an instance where it would have an evolutionary effect without an ecological effect. But the question kind of still stands that it's really hard to prove that predators are actually ecologically controlling prey numbers. Now, there's this idea called the Arringtons Hypothesis, and that essentially says no. Okay. Now, what Arrington's hypothesis says is that that predators don't control prey numbers because there's this idea of this doomed surplus. Okay. So think about white-tailed deer, throughout the year. Right about now in September, there's a bunch of babies that were born, in April and May, and things were great during the summer, but now the weather starts to change and food starts to get more scarce, and there's this doomed surplus, right? There's all these baby deer that are essentially going to die out, and it's okay because the population will do just fine due to there being so many extra individuals, right? This is one of the reasons why we have deer hunting right before the harshest winter weather, because we're kind of taking advantage. And we know that there is somewhat a doomed surplus in lots of different animals, especially in very temperate areas. But, where we have strong winters, we know that a lot of organisms are going to die in these harsher winter months. So we can take off part of some of those deer individuals, so there's more food for the rest of the deer throughout that winter season, and fewer will die of starvation. There's still going to be deer that are die of starvation before the food comes back in the spring, but there'll be fewer that do die. So this Arrington's hypothesis kind of goes with that, because there is this doomed surplus, and it's kind of another aspect of it is that prey are regulated by competition for these predator-free sites. So the number of prey that can escape predation are really just the ones that make it through that winter, and the ones that can find areas that don't have a bunch of predators. So that's one side of the argument, and I think there is something here, that there are certain species, certain populations in certain areas that kind of fit this example. Like maybe wood ducks are an example here. Wood ducks, here's the male, here's a female. They need these tree holes, and this is where they have their babies, and it's really hard. Predators can't get in there very easy. There's not that many predators that would be able to go after the little baby wood ducks, this high up in a tree. And maybe those are predator-free sites, and the wood ducks that try to have babies in other areas just completely fail right away. They don't. The babies get eaten right away because they're just not set up for that. So the wood ducks are probably an example where predators probably are only controlling them because they can't find these predator-free sites. Now, So that's one side of the argument. The other side, though, is um, predators probably do control prey, but it depends on the trophic level. Okay, so the last the last PLQ that we read had to do with Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin. Sometimes they call it the HSS hypothesis, or the why the world is green hypothesis. And after reading that, you should remember that these tridivores are food limited, right? We know that they're competing over these things that are dying, and then the plants are competing for light and nutrients. So the question is, what happens to these herbivores? They don't seem to be food limited, right? Because literally the world, at least on land, the world is green, so there's plenty of food out there. There don't seem to be, completely wiped out by natural disasters or winter or something. So it must be the predators that are controlling them. So then what's controlling the predators is kind of they're food limited by their prey, right? So that's just another way to basically say competition. Okay, if they're food limited, that means that there's not enough food, so they're going to be competing over this food. And, there's really nothing else that is going to be the top predators. They're not really eating each other, right? Like coyotes don't really eat each other. Wolves don't really eat each other. There's not really, at least in the terrestrial environments, species that do that very often. Aquatic systems, that's certainly not the case. There's plenty of cannibalism going on there. But, what else is going to be controlling these predators? It's pretty much just competition. And one of the reasons why we can see this probably be true is that in areas where we've had an herbivore come in that has no predators, they can completely defoliate like entire forests. So the gypsy moth is an example where we have whole forests taking out all the leaves in whole forests where these gypsy moths are eating all of the trees and killing these trees because the gypsy moth has no predators. So there's plenty of examples where invasives show in at least a 2 trophic level system that when released from that predation pressure, those herbivores can explode in number. So what we see is this like kind of alternating levels of control, where in a 3 trophic level system, the carnivores, we know they're going to be, since they're not feeding on each other really, they're going to be competing over these herbivores. So competition is going to be controlling the carnivores. Herbivores, predation is going to be the main control on that, which then means the producers are back to competition, right? Because there's not enough herbivores to basically eat all of these producers. And what we see is, I forget the author right now, but when you look at systems basically that have different numbers of look at systems that have different number of trophic levels, you see that there are different controls on all the different trophic levels. So if you have a system, and the example of 1 trophic level is these Australia, when those prickly pear cactuses invaded, okay, right at first. Essentially what you have is just a whole system where there's no predators. Nothing can eat these cactuses. So you get essentially whole swaths, whole areas of land where these organisms will be competing with each other, right? And that is there's no trophic levels above this because there's nothing eating these plants, and so they're just going to be competing essentially over space or light or nutrients. Doesn't really matter, but we know that the only thing that's going to be able to control them is competition. When we bring in that predator, then what we see is those predators do a really good job of controlling those plants. So predators, remember here, I'm talking about herbivores. Those cactus moths that came in and we're going to be eating all of those cacti. So in a two trophic level system, what we see is the top levels are going to be competing over their food sources and controlling the producers. But really, most terrestrial systems, remember, have three trophic levels, three real trophic levels. Now you could say, well, aren't there parasites on those carnivores? And so we have a fourth trophic level. And aren't there parasites on those parasites? Yes, but at least ecologically important trophic levels, we really only have three dominant ones. So producers, herbivores, and carnivores. So this is kind of sitting in that world with the Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin, paper where they say that carnivores are going to be competing over their food sources, which are the herbivores. So those carnivores will be controlling. So the herbivores will be controlled by predation. And then since those carnivores are keeping the herbivore numbers down, we don't see that the producers are not really limited by those herbivores, and so they're going to be competing with each other. Now, what we see, though, it's really more interesting when we bring it into aquatic systems, because what we see with aquatic system is, at least with lakes, and to some extent the oceans too, we have four real trophic levels, where you've got the producers, which are tiny little algae, the main herbivores, which are tiny little crustacean zooplankton, and then above that you have small fish that are eating those zooplankton, and then you have bigger fish that are eating those small fish. So again, if we start at that top level, what we see is there is, the only thing that's really going to be controlling that top level is competition over that food for those carnivores. Those carnivores then are going to be controlled by predation, which means there's going to be a whole lot of herbivores out there that'll be competing. They're going to be controlled by competition for those producers, for those algae. And those algae then are going to be controlled by predators, being those zooplankton. And this is one of the reasons why you have, why lakes are the color that they are, right? So why is the world green? Well, it's because there's so many producers. Those producers are not controlled by the herbivores. But in a scenario where those producers, with a 4-level scenario, where those producers are controlled by predators, they're going to keep those numbers really low, and that's why most lakes, at least in their natural state, are clear, right? Because for most of the ocean and most of aquatic systems, the aquatic systems are not green. So the question is, well, what about Lake Erie, right? That is, it's a green lake, and you can see from the satellite picture that it's relatively eutrophic. So what's happening there? And we know that there are other eutrophic lakes. And the answer kind of just lies with, well, there's if you want to think of this as another trophic level, you can for the purposes of this argument. But nutrients essentially are unlimited in this scenario, right? So what you see is that those nutrients can kind of override the predation, and what we see is there's actually a lot of predation in eutrophic lakes. There's a lot of predation resistant algae, so that they won't be controlled by this predation and can get huge numbers of cyanobacteria because they can escape this predation thing. But they're only competitively dominant when there's a lot of nutrients, right? Because it takes a lot of nutrients to grow those predation resistant forms. So what we see is there's a kind of a switch here going on. So the PLQ for this week then is an article written by Mary Power and some colleagues of hers. She's an active aquatic ecologist. She's getting older now, but she's still relatively active, and she did a lot of really cool work on these streams and small streams in Oklahoma. And these small streams had three big players: largemouth bass, and there was some smallmouth bass too, but they're piscivore, meaning they eat fish. The central stone roller was the numerically dominant herbivore, and they graze on this filamentous algae called Spirogyra. And Spirogyra was the main algae found in these streams. So what she noticed was when there was like two kinds of pools. There were these clear blue pools, and there were these dark green algae dominated pools. And when she looked more closely at them, she found that the clear blue pools were really shallow, and they had a bunch of stone rollers in them and didn't have any algae. The deep green pools had, were deeper, so the bass could survive in there. And those bass, what they did was they ate up all the stone rollers, so there weren't any herbivores, or at least not very many herbivores, not enough that the algae could kind of grow almost out of control, right? And you had a filamentous algae benthic mat where you'd have all of these all this algae growing, right? So what we see is that, in this blue shallow area, in the shallow pools, you have this two trophic level system where we have the herbivores competing. They're controlled by competition over that algae, and the algae themselves are controlled by those predators, those herbivores. And you don't see very many producers then. Whereas you have a three-level system, a three-trophic level system in these greener, deeper pools, where you have the carnivores, which will be competing over those central stone rollers, the herbivores. So they will be controlled by predation. And then there won't be very many herbivores, so the producers themselves will really only be competing, in this case, over light. And if you go look at this, right, these results that they see were, let me go back here, were exactly the same of what we expect in these two-level systems and these three-level systems. So that's kind of a fundamental paper to read, looking at some trophic cascade kind of things and some really interesting dynamics based on, just how deep these pools are. So what's really important we know that there are plenty of cases where prey are controlled by predators, right? But it requires some certain conditions. You can't have prey being controlled by predators in a really, really harsh habitat, right? So if you think about, this nice, cool, placid stream versus this crazy, ice flow, what is going to be controlling, the ecology of this system? It's these ice jams coming through, scouring out the bottom of the stream, and are really going to be important. So if a habitat is like rebounding after winter or in continuous recovery after like really flow pulses, really frequent flow pulses or floods, they're never going to be able to be controlled by predators because they'll be in a continuous state of like low on that logistic curve, and it's they're not going to be controlled by predation. It'll be kind of just controlled by time since the last big disturbance. So what we see is as habitat gets harsher, I realize you can't read that great. As habitats get harsher, we see less of an importance of predation going on. And that's kind of pretty much across the board. We also see some trade-offs when looking at predation resistance versus competitive ability. We see some weird trade-offs. Now, what do I mean by a trade-off, right? So I thought it was funny. This is Brian O'Neill. He is a offensive lineman for the Minnesota Vikings. He's 6'7", 298 pounds. This is also Brian O'Neill. He is 5'9", 172. He is a hockey player that's been in the NHL at times, but currently he's the captain for the U.S. national team. And, so they're both incredible athletes. But a 6'7", 298-pound lineman does not make a good hockey player. A 5'9", 172-pound hockey player does not make a good offensive lineman. So there's trade-offs between body size and body shape and what that means for the abilities in sports, right? Now the same thing happens with organisms, and we see this really interesting trade-off that as we increase resource acquisition, right? That's kind of like looking at a competitive ability, I guess. But what we see is you really only can be kind of like two things. You can either be predation resistant, so think about like a tortoise, right, with its giant shell. Nothing's going to be able to eat that. But it's freaking slow, right? It doesn't have the ability to get food really quickly, so we put it low on this rate of resource acquisition. And so it can't really compete very well because those it doesn't have any it can't grow very fast, it cannot move very fast, but it sure as hell is predation resistant, right? Whereas think about a bunny would sit over at this really high competitive ability, but they get hammered by predators, right? So they can eat food extremely quickly, they can gain resources very quickly, but they just cannot and they can breed numbers really quickly, right? But they cannot hide against predators, right? They're out in the middle of a little grassland eating their grass, and they get picked off by hawks or foxes or coyotes all the time, right? So this is a really common trade-off that we see. And it's really interesting to see how these type of things play off of being controlled by predators. All right, so with that, that's it for now, and I'll see you later.